Let's get into global warming because
Okay.
talk about uncertainty. There are a lot of folks out there who see there still being a debate regarding global warming, regarding man's influence on global. We just had a Financial Times op-ed piece with 125 plus scientists, quote unquote,
Well, yeah, quote
who
unquote.
said that the global warming does not exist because for the past 17, 16 years, the Earth has not warmed.
Well, it's complete nonsense. First of all, the scientists weren't climate scientists. They weren't the scientists actually studying. In fact, many of them weren't scientists. They just had science degrees. And the important thing to realize is a PhD is just a PhD. You can get PhDs that'll say the Earth is flat. I could get 50 PhD scientists around the world to say the Earth is flat. Would that be a controversy? People have to be skeptical, and they should be skeptical when they see op-eds like that. What are these people? What are their expertise? And what's the data? And their data is nonsense. There are 3 bits of data that have just come out. First of all, global climate change is happening. It's not some weird prediction of the future. It's already started to happen. And the evidence that that humans have been contributing a significant fraction of that is unambiguous. And it's getting even scarier. We have just entered October. The month before last was the 332nd consecutive warmest month for global temperatures in history. 332. If you're 27 years old, you've never lived in a month which is colder than average. Okay, and that alone is telling you the Earth is warming up. But in fact, we can measure it in other ways. Another study, an independent study that just came out, is telling us something very scary, that the ice sheets unambiguously in Greenland and Antarctica are melting. Melting at a rate that it accounts, in fact, as you would expect from global warming, for a rise in sea levels. Rise in sea levels isn't fiction, it's happening. About a half an inch in the last 15 or 20 years or so. A half an inch may not seem like a lot, but it could be the precursor of much worse. And indeed, the predictions of climate models that say human industrial activity, which produces, it's physics. You see, it isn't liberal or conservative, it's physics. You put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and you are going to trap more of the sun's heat. And you can make a prediction about what that's going to do to the climate, and the predictions suggest that, in fact, they're very conservative, but they suggest that the ice sheet in Greenland may be melting. And for a while, they said, well, Antarctica might be melting too, but there wasn't unambiguous data. But we now see even Antarctica, where we predict the melting should be lower, is actually melting. And that's the other thing about global climate change. It doesn't mean it's happening the same everywhere. In Northern Europe, we predict it'll get colder. Okay, so climate scientists have complex models that have changed a lot in the last 20 years, and their predictions are being vindicated. And this melting in Greenland is a great concern because it's nonlinear. Because once it starts to melt, if the melting water goes down below the ice sheets, it can take the whole ice sheet out to the ocean. And this stuff can be nonlinear. We've seen throughout history, if you measure ocean levels over the last 500,000 years at the same time with carbon dioxide levels, that the oceans have changed in depth and in height, more importantly, by plus or minus 80 meters. 80 meters. And that's
But for those who say this has happened in the past, this is a cyclical change. Again, these scientists and whoever they are, they say that they have data that in the last 16 years, they're saying that there is, and of course the critics say they're cherry picking the 16. It's like basically saying the Earth is 25 whatever miles long or 17 feet long, whatever you want to choose.
Exactly. If you that we were talking about the age of the Earth. If you say the Earth is 6,000 years old, as some people do, including some people in our state legislature, and Senator Marco Rubio recently, what's ridiculous about that? We'll come back to climate change, but we made this segue. You might say, well, why can't we teach kids that some people like to believe because the Bible says that the Earth is 6,000 years old. The point is the Earth isn't 6,000 years old. And if you think that the Bible insists the Earth saying that, you better re-examine the Bible. Because it is such a humongous error. We know the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And teaching kids that, well, you can think it's 6,000 years old or you can think it's 4.5 billion years old is like telling kids when we're doing geography, you can decide that the distance from New York to Los Angeles is 2,500 miles or 17 feet. You decide. And 17 feet is so ludicrous, at 6,000 years old is embarrassing. It's embarrassing. We know human civilizations that have been around for more than 6,000 years old. We have relics that are older than 6,000 years old, much less the evidence of the Earth being 4.5 billion years old. But with climate change, so there's this invented controversy about the age of the Earth, for which there's no controversy. And this global warming has been an invented controversy. A lot of money has been spent convincing people there's a controversy. But these 125 scientists are, we had a similar, because you can get people who don't believe in evolution to have campaigns where they have a few quote-unquote scientists that write. So we had a campaign with a T-shirt with 500 scientists named Steve believe in evolution. Because, 125 scientists is nothing. There are 2,000 scientists working on the International Panel on Climate Change, people who do this for a living, and they're not paid to prove that there's human climate. They're paid to try and figure out how it works.
A couple of NASA astronauts, ex-NASA astronauts, they say global warming doesn't exist.
Well, I would hate to say that some of the other things that ex-NASA astronauts have said. NASA astronauts are NASA astronauts. They're not climate scientists. And the point is, it isn't he said, she said. The data is unambiguous. 332 consecutive warming months. The ice sheets melting faster than they've ever melted before. And, in fact, as I say, a half an inch, and it's accelerating, and this is happening over decades. There are certainly, if you look at history, global variations in climate over centuries and millennia, but this is happening over decades on a timescale that's exactly the same as the exponential growth in our production of carbon dioxide. And the thing that's even scarier is another result that just came out, which I find the most sobering. That in spite of all of the talk about the potential dangers of climate change and Hurricane Sandy and flooding in low-lying areas, 2011 was the record year for production of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it looks like 2012 will even be higher. And if you look at the models, and let's talk about uncertainty. The climate models say we really need to keep the temperature rise in the Earth to less than 3.6 degrees unless we want unbelievable ocean level rising and storms, and so that should be a target. That was a target we tried to make. Well, because we keep adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and it takes hundreds of years for that to go away, it's cumulative. So had we started to cut our carbon dioxide production, if you due to fossil fuel burning, had we started to cut it in 2011, we would have had to cut about 3% per year to get to the goal of the Earth only warming by 3.6 degrees. If we wait till 2015, we have to cut it by 5%. If we wait till 2020, we have to cut it by 10%, and that's not going to happen. Speaking about fiscal cliffs, we're on the edge of a climate cliff. If we are basically almost over the edge, it is almost unavoidable that the Earth will heat up at a level that really hasn't happened in the last 500,000 years.
And man cannot adapt or find a way to fix this problem, or are we just
it looks like we may have to adapt, but adapting means living a very different life. Adapting for us means dealing with potentially much stronger hurricanes and extremely rare events happening more often, building seawalls around New York or giving up New Orleans. But it's even worse because, again, the climate model suggests that in some sense the worst effects will be near the equator. Well, near the equator are where most of the world's population, especially poor population, exists. There's going to be huge amounts of land mass that are removed. Devastation. When you have 2 billion people you're displacing, if you don't expect socio-political consequences of that, there are problems. And the point is, let's say you can say, what I wanted to say is, we can say this with a 70% likelihood. Okay, that we need to cut by these levels by 2020 to have a 70% likelihood.
That's your uncertainty on this one.
That's the uncertainty, that the climate will only raise by 3.6 degrees. And you might say, 70%. But when you think of the possible problems, the fact that the oceans have increased not by plus or minus inches, but by 80 meters, with even less variation of carbon dioxide, you've got to say, can we afford to ignore this?